History as we know it is rarely neutral. It has been shaped, rewritten, and filtered through the pens of conquerors and priests who had everything to gain by deciding what was remembered and what was erased. When we dig beneath the surface of the familiar stories, a striking absence emerges: the memory of black gods who once ruled the spiritual imagination of entire civilizations. These gods were not minor deities tucked into the margins of myth. They were creators, lawgivers, healers, and protectors whose influence stretched across continents. Yet their names, faces, and kingdoms have been silenced, buried under centuries of erasure. In Kemet, Nubia, Kush, and the heartlands of Africa, these gods were seen as more than distant overseers. They walked with the people, embodied in fertility of the land, the rhythm of the rivers, and the cycles of sun and moon. Osiris was not merely a god of death, he was the very promise that life would return after loss. Isis was not merely a goddess of love, she was the eternal mother whose magic reassembled the broken world. Horus was not merely a falcon god, he was the principle of renewal, vision, and just kingship. These were not abstract figures, but living symbols of a cosmic order deeply intertwined with daily survival. What made these gods especially powerful was not just their mythic qualities, but their reflection of the people themselves. They were depicted with black features, dark skin, braided or coiled hair, and garments that honored African identity. To worship them was not to submit to something alien, but to recognize the divine within one's own ancestry. This image of the sacred, that divinity bore the faces of the people themselves, gave profound strength. It created a sense of belonging in the universe, a conviction that the gods understood human suffering because they had lived, loved, and struggled alongside their followers. It was precisely this closeness that made them dangerous to those who sought control. A people who see themselves in their gods are hard to dominate. A people whose rituals connect them directly to the forces of creation are difficult to subjugate. And so the campaign of erasure began, slow, deliberate, and devastating. Myths were rewritten. Statues were broken or rebranded. Whole pantheons were dismissed as idols, their temples defiled, their names spoken only in whispers. The black gods, once pillars of civilization, were redefined as shadows, relegated to the margins of paganism and sorcery. Yet traces remain. In every flood of the Nile, Osiris still breathes. In every healing song whispered over a child, Isis still lives. In every leader who rises against injustice, Horus spreads his wings. These echoes remind us that erasure is never complete. Memory lingers in stone, in ritual, in blood. The gods still call, even when their names are hidden. And when we begin to uncover those traces, we find more than scattered myths. We uncover entire worlds, kingdoms built under their guidance, societies shaped by their laws, and legacies too vast to vanish. The black gods were not erased because they were irrelevant. They were erased because they built something so enduring, so empowering, that later powers had no choice but to bury it. The black gods were not only worshipped in myth, they were the architects of nations. Their principles shaped a kingdom so advanced, so enduring, that later historians struggled to explain its origin. This was no minor tribal chiefdom or loose confederation. It was a structured, ordered, and luminous civilization, one that stood as living proof of the power of its divine patrons. And though much has been erased or mislabeled, fragments allow us to glimpse this forbidden kingdom. Its cities were not accidents of trade, but designs of sacred geometry. Temples aligned with the solstices, pyramids rose in harmony with Orion's belt, and palaces stood where rivers bent like protective arms. Architecture itself was prayer. Every corridor, every pillar, every alignment testified that the people who built them understood the universe as living law. They did not simply inhabit the earth, they tuned it like an instrument, making every stone vibrate with cosmic order. The heart of this kingdom pulsed with rivers, most notably the Nile, which the people saw not merely as water but as Osiris's lifeblood. Its annual flooding was no disaster, it was resurrection. Each inundation renewed the soil, mirroring the cycle of death and rebirth taught by the gods. This rhythm was central to agriculture, ensuring that abundance flowed not by chance but by participation in divine order. To sow seeds was to enter covenant with the gods. To reap harvest was to witness their promise fulfilled. Power in this kingdom was not concentrated in kings alone. Yes, rulers bore crowns and sat on thrones, but their authority was conditional. A king who strayed from Ma'at lost legitimacy. People expected not domination but stewardship. Kings were sons of Ra, only so long as their rule reflected light and justice. This kingdom thrived because its foundation was not conquest but balance. Every decision, from law to labor, had to harmonize with the cosmic scales. The economy itself reflected divine principles. Trade routes stretched across deserts and seas, linking the kingdom to gold, incense, ivory, and grain. Yet trade was not seen as mere profit but as reciprocity. To cheat in measure or hoard in greed was to invite chaos. Markets were places of both commerce and morality, where Ma'at's feather hovered invisibly over every transaction. In this, the kingdom built resilience. Its wealth was sustained not by plunder but by principle. Spiritual life wove through everything. Rituals marked births, harvests, battles, and deaths. Festivals were not distractions but renewals, affirming that the gods still walked with their people. At dawn, priests invoked Ra to rise. At dusk, they armed him against Apophis. Women sang hymns to Isis as they ground grain. Men poured libations to Osiris as they sowed fields. The divine was never distant. The kingdom itself was a temple. Every action a ritual, every day a prayer. Foreign visitors marveled at its order. Some recorded it in awe, others in envy, and still others in fear. For here was a kingdom whose strength did not depend on foreign gods, foreign armies, or foreign approval. Its power came from within, from the gods who had shaped the cosmos and entrusted their people with law, balance, and wisdom. To outsiders, this was a threat. To the people themselves, it was simply life. This kingdom's existence has been obscured not because it lacked greatness, but because its greatness contradicted later narratives. If Africa built temples aligned with the stars, if black gods taught law before Moses, if resurrection was spoken of before the New Testament, then the entire structure of later religions would be shaken. Erasure became the tool not of clarity but of control. And yet, the stones remain. Temples still catch the sun. Inscriptions still whisper divine names. Oral traditions still preserve fragments of glory. The Forbidden Kingdom may be hidden in official histories, but it lives in memory, in soil, in sky. And as we uncover it, we begin to see not only how it thrived, but why it was targeted. For the kingdom's strength was not only material, it was spiritual. Its wealth was not only in gold, but in wisdom. And that wisdom, given by the gods, carried secrets powerful enough to unsettle every empire that followed. Every kingdom rises on law, but not all law is the same. Some laws are made by rulers for convenience, others by conquerors for control. The laws of the Forbidden Kingdom, however, were not merely human decrees. They were reflections of the cosmic order set in motion by the gods themselves. These were not rules to be enforced at the point of a sword, but principles woven into the fabric of the universe. To live by them was to live in harmony with creation. To break them was to invite chaos into the heart of the community. At the center of these laws stood Ma'at. She was not simply a goddess to be worshipped, but the very embodiment of truth, balance, justice, and reciprocity. Her feather was more than a symbol, it was the measure of every action. A king who acted unjustly, a merchant who cheated in trade, a neighbor who lied in judgment, all tipped the scales toward imbalance. Justice, then, was not abstract, but cosmic. Courtrooms, markets, and fields were all extensions of Ma'at's temple. This kingdom's legal system reflected that sacred truth. Disputes were resolved not merely by punishment but by restoration. The goal was always to return balance. If a thief stole grain, the matter was not only about loss of property but the disruption of harmony. To restore it, the thief might repay with harvests, labor, or ritual acts of reconciliation. Justice was measured not in retribution but in equilibrium. The people understood that these laws were not external impositions but the very rhythm of existence. To lie was to weigh down one's own soul. To exploit was to invite imbalance into one's own household. To oppress was to plant seeds of rebellion that would eventually grow wild. By contrast, to act truthfully, to honor contracts, to treat others with fairness, was to align oneself with the eternal order, ensuring prosperity, peace, and continuity. These principles extended into family life. Marriage was not simply a contract between two people, but a joining of households under Ma'at's balance. Children were taught to honor parents not out of fear, but as acknowledgement that life itself was a gift sustained by ancestors and gods. Even hospitality became a sacred duty. To welcome the stranger was to affirm the universal order that binds all under the same sky. Agriculture, too, was bound by these divine laws. Farmers knew that greed over harvesting, hoarding, or failing to give offerings would offend the balance. Fields thrived when honored through ritual libations, when first fruits were dedicated to Osiris, when gratitude shaped labor. Work was sacred not because it enriched kings, but because it aligned with cosmic law. Even kings were subject to this framework. Coronation ceremonies required rulers to swear allegiance to Ma'at, not as figureheads, but as servants of balance. A king who strayed too far could be judged not only by his people but by the gods themselves. Natural disasters, famines, or unrest were interpreted as signs of imbalance, warnings that law had been betrayed. The throne was a burden as much as a privilege, a daily reminder that power without justice was illegitimate. What makes these laws extraordinary is their longevity. Centuries after the kingdom's decline, echoes of Ma'at still appear in other traditions. The Hebrew commandments, the Proverbs, even later philosophical codes, bear uncanny resemblance to African wisdom literature like the instruction of Tahotep. Yet while later cultures preserved fragments, the original source, the Black Gods and their forbidden kingdom, was erased from the official record. The laws of this kingdom remind us that civilization is not merely built on walls or armies, but on alignment with cosmic principles. Without balance, even the greatest empire collapses. With balance, even a hidden kingdom can outlast erasure, its influence whispering across time. And it is in the whisper of these laws that we find the next great thread of the story, the kingdom's guardianship of knowledge, the sacred wisdom entrusted by the gods to ensure that order and memory could endure against all forgetting. Every great civilization is built not only on labor and law, but also on wisdom. The Forbidden Kingdom, guided by its black gods, knew that knowledge was a sacred inheritance, not a luxury. To record, to teach, to preserve these were divine acts, continuations of the work of Thoth, the god of writing, measurement, and cosmic memory. In this kingdom, wisdom was not separated from faith. To study was to pray, and to learn was to participate in eternity. Temples were the first universities. Within their stone walls, scribes trained under the gaze of hieroglyphs that were more than letters, they were spells, each symbol carrying layers of meaning. To write was to channel divine energy, to capture truth in visible form. The scribe's reed pen was not mere tool but wand, its strokes echoing the first words spoken by the Creator at the dawn of time. Through writing, memory outlived mortality, and the wisdom of the gods survived the fragility of flesh. The subjects studied were as vast as the cosmos. Astronomy was central, for the heavens were seen as divine scripture. Priests charted the rising of Sirius, the movement of Orion, the phases of the moon. From these patterns, they created calendars that guided agriculture, festivals, and prophecy. To look at the stars was not to indulge in curiosity, but to listen to the gods' design. written in light across the night sky. Mathematics, too, was sacred. Geometry aligned temples with solstices and pyramids with cardinal points. Ratios, proportions, and harmonies were not abstract puzzles, but reflections of Ma'at's balance. Every calculation was a moral act, ensuring that structures embodied cosmic order. This is why their monuments endure. They were not built against nature, but in harmony with it. Medicine combined empirical skill with spiritual knowledge. Healers knew the properties of herbs, the rhythms of the body, and the incantations that invoked divine aid. Illness was not seen as mere physical affliction, but as imbalance, requiring restoration of harmony between body, spirit, and cosmos. To heal was to participate in the work of Isis, who restored Osiris from fragmentation to wholeness. In this kingdom, science and spirituality were never enemies. They were two hands of the same divine truth. Wisdom literature formed another pillar. Texts like the Instruction of Ptah-hotep and the Instruction of Amenemope offered moral guidance. Be humble, be fair, treat others with dignity, listen before you speak. These writings predate and anticipate later traditions, yet their African origins were long hidden. To read them today is to hear the voice of the gods speaking across millennia, urging humanity toward balance. This sacred knowledge was not reserved only for elites. Though scribes and priests held the deepest archives, wisdom circulated in proverbs, songs, and rituals. Farmers planting by the stars, mothers singing healing songs, builders aligning houses to the sun, all participated in the kingdom's intellectual and spiritual fabric. Knowledge was alive, embodied in daily practice, ensuring that cosmic truth infused every aspect of society. But it was precisely this intimacy with divine knowledge that made the kingdom dangerous to outsiders. A people who charted the stars did not need foreign prophets to tell them of creation. A people who wrote in sacred script did not need imported scriptures. A people whose laws and medicine flowed from gods within their own image were hard to subdue. Suppression would not only target temples and rituals, but the very knowledge that sustained them. Even so, fragments of this wisdom endured. Ancient proverbs reappeared in foreign texts, stripped of their African context. Healing practices resurfaced in folk traditions, renamed but not forgotten. Star knowledge persisted in oral lore, waiting for rediscovery. The keepers of sacred knowledge, though persecuted, ensured that truth could never be wholly silenced. For wisdom, like the gods themselves, is eternal, and as long as memory survives, it carries forward not only what was learned, but what was built. And from this foundation of knowledge, the Forbidden Kingdom rose in splendor, leaving behind monuments that still defy time and whisper of divine design. If wisdom preserved the gods' truths in words, then architecture preserved them in stone. The Forbidden Kingdom was more than a collection of cities. It was a living temple, its monuments aligned with the cosmos, its walls inscribed with eternal law. To walk through its corridors was to walk through creation itself. Every arch, every pillar, every alignment told a story. The gods were here, shaping not only the heavens above but the world beneath. Temples were built not as places of mere worship, but as microcosms of the universe. Entering a sanctuary was to step into the primordial waters of Nun, to ascend through chambers that mirrored the rise of creation, and to stand at the Holy of Holies where heaven and earth touched. The ceilings were painted with constellations, floors represented fertile earth, and columns blossomed like papyrus and lotus, symbols of birth and renewal. Architecture was theology in stone. Among the most striking examples were the pyramids. Often misunderstood as mere tombs, they were resurrection machines, stairways to the stars. Their sides aligned precisely with the cardinal points. Their shafts pointed toward Orion and Sirius. To the people of the kingdom, these stars were not distant lights but homes of gods. Osiris in Orion, Isis in Sirius. When a king died, his soul was believed to ascend along these alignments, rejoining the divine order. The pyramid was not death's prison, but eternity's gateway. The temple of Karnak, vast and sprawling, embodied the grandeur of this vision. Its axis aligned with the rising sun at the solstice, so that once a year, dawn's first light pierced its gates and illuminated the inner sanctuary of Amun. This was no accident of engineering, it was cosmic choreography. Each year, the temple reenacted creation, reaffirming the bond between gods and people. Such precision testifies to astronomical mastery and to the belief that architecture itself must mirror divine rhythm. But even smaller shrines carried this sacred alignment. Village temples faced rivers, invoking Osiris's lifeblood. Circular stone enclosures mirrored star cycles, ensuring that even local worship was woven into cosmic harmony. Farmers built altars beside fields, aligning them to solstices so that every planting was not only agricultural but liturgical. These practices showed that the divine was not limited to great monuments. It infused every act of life. Obelisks rose as frozen sunbeams, capturing Ra's light in stone. Their shadows marked the hours, transforming cities into sundials. Each obelisk was a prayer of permanence, proof that even as empires rise and fall, the sun's path and the god's law remain constant. To this day, their precision astonishes engineers, but to the ancients, they were not puzzles. They were offerings, reminders that time itself bends to divine rhythm. What sets these monuments apart is not only their scale, but their philosophy. Unlike later empires that built fortresses of conquest, this kingdom built sanctuaries of alignment. The purpose was not domination but harmony, not fear but renewal. The gods did not demand terror but reverence, and the stones bear witness to a society that saw itself as co-creators with divinity. And yet, this architecture's very endurance made it a threat to later narratives. For even when priests were silenced and myths rewritten, the stones continued to speak. Anyone who looked could see that Africans had charted the stars, mastered mathematics, and built monuments aligned with the cosmos long before foreign empires rose. To erase the gods, the conquerors had to also reframe the stones, dismissing them as mysteries, denying the genius of their builders, attributing them to anyone but the Black Kingdom that raised them. Still, the stones endure. They catch the same sun, mark the same solstices, and whisper the same truths. Their very existence is resistance, proof that erasure can never be complete. And in their shadow, we glimpse not only the gods' presence but the society that flourished under their care, a society whose daily life was as sacred as its temples. To understand the Forbidden Kingdom, it is not enough to marvel at its monuments or study the wisdom carved on its walls. The true essence of this civilization lived in its people: farmers, artisans, mothers, children, soldiers, and scribes, all moving in rhythm with the divine order. Daily life was not divided between sacred and profane. Every action, no matter how ordinary, was infused with the presence of the gods. At dawn, the day began with Ra. As the sun rose, families offered prayers or simple libations, thanking the light for its return. To them, the sunrise was not routine but victory, proof that Ra had once again defeated Apophis in the underworld. Children were taught from their earliest days to greet the sun with gratitude, for in its warmth lay both life and cosmic assurance. Farmers formed the backbone of society. They read the flooding of the Nile as the breath of Osiris, guiding when to plant and harvest. Before sowing seeds, they poured water as libation into the soil, whispering blessings for fertility. Harvest was celebrated with songs to Isis and Hathor, goddesses of abundance, whose joy was believed to swell the grain. To work the land was not drudgery but partnership with gods who had given the earth as sacred trust. Craftsmen, too, saw their work as devotion. A stonecutter shaping a column was not simply building but reenacting the act of creation, carving order out of raw chaos. A jeweler placing gold inlaid with lapis lazuli honored Hathor, goddess of beauty and music. Even the potter shaping clay remembered Khnum, the ram-headed god who molded humanity on his wheel. Each act of craft echoed divine creation. Family life was built on balance, reflecting the cosmic harmony of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Marriage was sacred union, not only between husband and wife, but between families and ancestors. Children were blessings of continuity, reminders that the god's cycle of birth and rebirth was present in human generations. Mothers often invoked Isis's protective power over infants, tying amulets of her image around their necks, whispering spells to guard them from harm. Meals were rituals of gratitude. Bread and beer, staples of life, were considered divine gifts. Before eating, families often set aside a small portion as offering to ancestors or local deities, acknowledging that nourishment was part of a larger cycle of reciprocity. Festivals multiplied this practice. Entire communities feasted in honor of gods, blending joy, music, and dance into living prayer. Education was also sacred. Children learned not only practical skills but proverbs, hymns, and moral codes. Scribes trained rigorously, for writing was considered Heka magic that captured the eternal. To be literate was to hold a spark of divine power, but even those who could not write carried wisdom in oral traditions, songs, and stories. Knowledge was not privilege but inheritance. Warriors defended the kingdom, but even their role was framed within Ma'at. They were not meant to conquer indiscriminately, but to preserve order against chaos, both literal and symbolic. Before battle, offerings were made to Sekhmet, goddess of fierce protection, and to Horus, whose falcon vision symbolized clarity in conflict. Victory was not celebrated with cruelty but with reaffirmations of balance, for war itself was dangerous to harmony and needed ritual purification afterward. The rhythm of life extended into death. Funerals were not ends but transitions. Bodies were prepared with care, invoking Anubis, guardian of the dead. Spells were recited to ensure the soul's safe passage, and the heart was believed to face Ma'at's scales in judgment. To live truthfully meant to face death without fear, for justice guaranteed safe entry into the afterlife where Osiris reigned. Every layer of society, from king to farmer, artisan to child, saw themselves as threads in a cosmic fabric. Life was not isolated, chaotic, or meaningless. It was woven tightly with the gods, ancestors, and the order of creation itself. This daily immersion in sacred rhythm gave the kingdom its resilience and continuity. Even as outside forces rose, the people's alignment with divine cycles ensured that balance endured in their homes, fields, and communities. And from these daily rhythms grew a culture so radiant it produced art, song, and stories of breathtaking power, creative expressions that were not entertainment but extensions of cosmic truth. The Forbidden Kingdom did not separate art from life or life from the sacred. To create was to participate in the God's act of creation, to echo the moment when order first emerged from chaos. Every carving, every song, every painted wall was a prayer in form and color, a reminder that beauty itself was a divine principle. The black gods were not distant muses, they were the very breath that animated the kingdom's creativity. Sculptors carved figures of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and countless others with features that reflected the people themselves. The dark stone of statues mirrored the dark skin of their worshippers, affirming that divinity looked like them. These statues were not inert idols but vessels for presence, believed to channel the god's essence when offerings were made. Even their proportions followed sacred geometry, ensuring that each figure reflected cosmic harmony. Paintings on temple walls told stories not in abstract allegory but in vibrant, living scenes. Farmers sowed fields under the watchful eye of Osiris. Isis spread protective wings over children. Ra's solar bark sailed across endless skies. Colors themselves were symbolic: green for rebirth, blue for eternity, gold for divinity. Every stroke reinforced the idea that human life was inseparable from divine rhythm. Music carried this presence further. The drum beat echoed the heartbeat of the cosmos, linking dancers to the pulse of creation. Flutes mimicked the wind, harps recalled the flowing of the Nile. Festivals erupted in sound and movement, but even quiet rituals carried music in chants and hymns. To sing was to align breath with spirit, each note invoking gods by vibration. Hathor, goddess of music and joy, was believed to dance with the people whenever songs filled the air. Literature also flourished, ranging from sacred hymns to wisdom texts to epic tales. Hymns praised gods with imagery that bound heaven and earth. Ra rises on the horizon, scattering darkness like a falcon spreads its wings. Wisdom texts reminded people of Ma'at, do not tilt the scales, for the gods weigh the heart. Tales spoke of gods and humans interacting, showing that divinity was not distant but intimate. Through these words, people were reminded daily that their choices, joys, and struggles mattered in the cosmic story. Even jewelry and clothing carried divine symbolism. Amulets shaped like the Ankh, the Eye of Horus, or scarabs were not decorations but protections. Gold reflected the light of Ra. Turquoise embodied Hathor's joy. Lapis lazuli carried the depth of the heavens. To wear them was to clothe oneself in cosmic power. Every bracelet, every bead was both adornment and prayer. Dance, too, was sacred. Movements imitated the cycles of the sun, the flight of birds, or the flowing of rivers. At funerals, dancers performed to guide souls safely into Osiris's realm. At festivals, they celebrated fertility, love, and renewal. The body itself was an instrument of devotion, expressing truths too deep for words. What made this art and creativity so powerful was that it did not separate beauty from truth. To paint dishonestly, to sing without reverence, to carve without proportion, these were not mere errors but betrayals of Ma'at. Art was a moral act, shaping not only objects but the soul of the community. Beauty was truth visible, and truth was beauty embodied. This is why conquerors feared such art. It spoke directly to the heart, bypassing imposed doctrines. Even when temples were toppled, the surviving statues, paintings, and songs whispered the presence of the gods. To gaze at them was to remember, to hear them was to awaken. Art became the most resilient form of resistance, preserving divine memory even when laws and rulers tried to suppress it. From this creative abundance flowed a culture that valued harmony, joy, and connection. But it also birthed something even more profound, a vision of the cosmos itself, where stars, planets, and time itself were seen as extensions of divine order. For the people of the Forbidden Kingdom, the night sky was not an empty canopy but a scroll written by divine hands. Every star carried meaning. Every constellation told a story. Every rising and setting marked a promise. To look upward was to read the gods' scripture, a cosmic manuscript that revealed both the origins of the universe and the destiny of humankind. Astronomy was not a curiosity. It was theology, prophecy, and calendar all at once. The most sacred of all stars was Sirius, known as Sopdet. Its annual rising just before the flood of the Nile announced renewal, marking the beginning of the new year. This was no coincidence to the people. They saw in Sirius the presence of Isis herself, guiding the waters of Osiris back into the land, ensuring fertility and abundance. Each year, as Sirius appeared on the horizon, hymns rose in celebration, proclaiming that creation had begun anew. Nearby, the constellation of Orion was Osiris's throne in the heavens. The 3 stars of Orion's belt aligned with the Great Pyramids, proof that the builders sought to anchor the earthly kingdom to the eternal order of the sky. To the people, Orion's presence was assurance that resurrection was real, that even after death, the soul could join Osiris in the stars. Burial rituals, pyramid alignments, and temple axes all reflected this belief, embedding eternity into stone and soil. The Milky Way itself was seen as the celestial Nile, mirroring the earthly river below. Its shimmering arc across the sky reminded people that what flowed on earth was but a reflection of divine waters above. To navigate the heavens was to understand one's place within both realms. The kingdom did not divide the spiritual from the material. The Nile and the Milky Way were one. As above, so below. Calendars were built upon this celestial wisdom. Priests observed solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles, aligning festivals and rituals with cosmic rhythms. When Ra's sun reached its highest point, temples blazed with light. When it dipped to its lowest, rituals of renewal prepared for its return. Time itself was sacred, divided not arbitrarily but according to the gods' choreography in the heavens. Astrology, too, had its place. The positions of stars and planets were read as messages, guiding kings in decisions of war and peace, advising farmers in planting and harvest, and shaping the rhythm of festivals. These were not superstitions but applications of cosmic law, belief that the same order governing the heavens also governed the earth. To ignore the stars was to ignore the god's voice. The people also mapped the cycles of Venus, which they linked to Hathor, goddess of love and fertility. Her bright presence in the twilight sky symbolized renewal of joy and the eternal rhythm of desire and creation. The phases of the moon were associated with Thoth, Lord of Wisdom, who balanced the waxing and waning of time itself. This cosmology shaped not only religion but identity. To be born under the rising of certain stars was to carry divine qualities. To die under certain constellations was to journey with gods aligned to those stars. Every human life was inscribed into the heavens, making existence itself a cosmic text. Foreign visitors marveled at the precision of this knowledge, yet many later denied its African origins. They attributed the star alignments to chance, the calendars to guesswork, the pyramids to impossible mysteries. In doing so, they stripped the people of their rightful place as the first astronomers, philosophers, and theologians of the cosmos. Yet the truth remains written in stone and sky alike. These people mapped the heavens long before foreign prophets wrote of creation, and this celestial vision did more than mark time. It infused the people with confidence that their lives mirrored eternity, that their kingdom was not fleeting but woven into the very structure of the universe. With such conviction, they built societies rooted not in fear of ending but in assurance of continuity. But with such knowledge also came danger, for a people aligned so closely with the cosmos, whose laws and rituals mirrored the stars, posed a challenge to later empires. To erase their gods, one would have to also erase the heavens, an impossible task. And so the campaign turned not to destruction of the stars, but to redefinition of their meanings, a rewriting of the cosmic story to serve new powers. The Forbidden Kingdom had flourished for centuries, guided by the principles of Ma'at, nourished by the Nile, and illuminated by the heavens. Its monuments stood as eternal witnesses, its laws ensured balance, its art and music sang of joy and continuity. Yet greatness, when misunderstood, often becomes a threat. To those beyond its borders, the kingdom's spiritual autonomy and cosmic knowledge were not wonders to admire but powers to fear and ultimately to suppress. Foreign traders and travelers first came in awe. They saw temples aligned with solstices, priests who could predict floods with precision, and healers who cured with herbs and incantations. But awe quickly turned to envy. These outsiders realized that the people of this kingdom did not look to them for wisdom or protection. They had no need for foreign gods, no hunger for foreign laws, no dependency on outside rulers. They lived in a world complete, ordered, and radiant with self-sufficiency. For empires built on expansion, this was intolerable. The gods themselves became the focal point of fear. Ra's daily triumph was seen as arrogance by those who worshipped lesser lights. Isis's mastery of magic was framed as sorcery, dangerous, and subversive. Osiris's resurrection was called a lie, threatening later faiths that claimed resurrection as their exclusive truth. To deny these gods was not enough. They had to be recast as enemies. their worship condemned as idolatry, their followers branded as misguided. This campaign was subtle at first. Outsiders spoke of the gods with ridicule, mocking the animal heads of Anubis or Horus, ignoring the deeper symbolism. They laughed at rituals they did not understand, dismissing them as superstition while quietly adopting fragments for their own use. In time, ridicule gave way to demonization. The same gods who had taught humanity balance and renewal were labeled demons, their symbols corrupted into emblems of evil. But the fear went deeper than theology. The kingdom's independence threatened imperial ambitions. A people who saw themselves reflected in their gods were difficult to conquer. How do you enslave someone who believes their soul is measured by truth itself, not by another's decree? How do you dominate a people who see their very land, their river, their stars, as sacred gifts from gods who look like them? To break such a people required breaking their gods first, so temples were targeted. Some were defaced, their hieroglyphs chiseled away, their statues shattered. Others were appropriated, rebranded as monuments to new deities. Rituals were outlawed or pushed underground. Priests and scribes were persecuted, their scrolls burned, their wisdom silenced. But suppression rarely works cleanly. In the attempt to erase, fragments always survive in whispers, in symbols, in memory. The most insidious tactic was rewriting. Foreign priests borrowed myths, recast them with new names, and declared them original. Stories of resurrection, divine mothers, cosmic battles between light and darkness, all lifted from the Forbidden Kingdom, stripped of their African roots, and claimed as revelation elsewhere. Over time, the world was taught that these truths came not from the black gods, but from foreign lands, leaving the origin hidden under centuries of denial. And yet, resistance endured. Mothers still tied amulets around their children. Farmers still poured libations into the earth. Elders still told stories of Isis, Osiris, and Horus under starlit skies. The gods could be outlawed, but they could not be erased from memory. The Forbidden Kingdom's spirit survived, even when its temples fell silent. But survival came at a cost. The people learned to live between worlds, one where their gods still breathed in secret, and another where new powers demanded allegiance. This tension would define centuries, as the struggle between memory and erasure shaped the destiny of an entire continent. The decline of the Forbidden Kingdom did not happen through simple conquest of armies. Its temples did not fall solely to the battering of stone, nor its people solely to chains. The deeper conquest was one of memory, a rewriting so deliberate that it still shapes how we think of gods, law, and history today. Erasure became an art form, practiced in silence, disguised as preservation, and wielded with precision. One of the most effective tools was appropriation. Myths that belonged to Isis, Osiris, and Horus were lifted wholesale, renamed, and resettled into foreign traditions. Isis, the divine mother whose magic restored life, became the prototype for later holy mothers. Osiris, Lord of Resurrection, was echoed in savior figures. Horus, falcon child of renewal, became shadowed in messianic sons. To the outside world, these seemed like original revelations, yet their roots were buried in African soil. The gods lived on, but under borrowed names, their origin denied. Another tool was demonization. The same divine powers once celebrated as protectors were rebranded as threats. Anubis, guardian of souls, became an emblem of the underworld's terror. Thoth's wisdom was twisted into forbidden sorcery. Rituals once celebrated as sacred channels of cosmic balance were condemned as witchcraft, dangerous to the soul. By this tactic, memory was not only buried but turned against itself, teaching the people to fear what their ancestors had loved. Silencing texts was equally devastating. Scrolls of wisdom were burned, libraries destroyed, inscriptions defaced. Where writings could not be destroyed, they were ignored, dismissed as curiosities, or reinterpreted through foreign lenses. Fragments like the Book of the Dead survived only as exotic objects, studied for their strangeness rather than revered for their truth. The intent was not simply to erase words, but to strip them of their authority, making them powerless in the eyes of new generations. Then came the recasting of monuments. Temples were converted to serve foreign gods. Hieroglyphs were chiseled into rubble or buried under new carvings. Yet even as new names were etched, the stones themselves resisted. The sun still struck their axes on solstice mornings. The pyramids still aligned with Orion's belt. No matter how much the conquerors attempted to overwrite, the architecture continued to proclaim truths in silence, whispering to anyone who could still read the language of stone. But perhaps the most damaging weapon of erasure was shame. People were taught to be ashamed of their own gods, their own rituals, their own symbols. Generations grew believing that their ancestors' practices were curses, that their own spiritual inheritance was evil. This internalized denial cut deeper than any sword. For once people reject their own memory, conquest becomes complete. Yet even shame cannot wholly destroy. Memory, though suppressed, survives in fragments, in lullabies, in charms whispered over fields, in stories told when no overseer listened. And here lies the paradox. The very act of erasure ensured survival. By appropriating myths, foreign powers unknowingly preserved them. By demonizing gods, they kept their names alive in distorted form. By silencing texts, they left fragments that could one day be rediscovered. The gods endured not because they were tolerated, but because they were too deeply woven into the world to be eliminated. This machinery of erasure shaped centuries, casting long shadows over how people viewed Africa, its gods, and its wisdom. Yet beneath those shadows, resistance brewed. For a kingdom built on Ma'at, truth cannot remain buried forever. Balance demands restoration, and memory demands return. And so, even as erasure spread, fragments of the gods' presence began to surface again, not in grand temples this time, but in the resilience of the people who refused to forget. When the temples were silenced and the monuments defaced, it might have seemed as if the black gods had vanished. But gods born from the rhythm of the sun and stars cannot simply disappear. They flowed into new vessels, hiding in plain sight, surviving in whispers, in songs, in rituals disguised as ordinary life. Their exile was not death, it was transformation. And through transformation, memory endured. In villages far from royal courts, people continued to tell stories under the cover of night. Elders recited myths of Isis and Osiris by firelight, passing them on as folk tales rather than scripture. Children grew up hearing of Horus, the falcon who defeated chaos, or Anubis who guided souls not as forbidden gods, but as familiar figures of morality and courage. Oral tradition became the ark in which divine truth sailed through the flood of suppression. Rituals persisted in subtle forms. Libations once poured openly at temple altars were now poured quietly at thresholds, at riverbanks, at graves. Offerings to Osiris became offerings to spirits of the ancestors. Hymns to Isis were sung as lullabies, stripped of titles but carrying her essence. Even agricultural rites, sowing seeds with whispered blessings, thanking the river for its abundance, preserved the gods' presence beneath the language of custom. Art concealed their memory. Amulets shaped like the ankh were worn as ornaments, their meaning obscured but never forgotten. The eye of Horus appeared in household carvings as a protective charm. Scarabs, symbols of rebirth, were traded as good luck tokens. Each object spoke a double language, mundane to outsiders, sacred to those who remembered. As centuries passed and foreign religions tightened their grip, the gods' survival grew more ingenious. In some places, Isis merged with new maternal figures, reappearing as saints and holy mothers. Her images were worshipped in chapels where her name was forgotten but her essence was alive. Osiris's cycle of death and resurrection resurfaced in savior myths, his truth smuggled into the very traditions that tried to replace him. Horus's triumph over chaos echoed in stories of messianic suns hidden in plain sight, his falcon wings folded but unbroken. Beyond Africa, the gods traveled with their people into exile and diaspora. When enslaved Africans were taken across oceans, they carried their deities with them, not in temples, but in memory and ritual. In the Americas and the Caribbean, Orishas like Shango, Oshun, and Ogun, kindred spirits of the older pantheon, were preserved under new names. Catholic saints became disguises for ancestral gods, allowing traditions to survive in secret under the eyes of masters. The forbidden gods adapted, refusing to be silenced even in chains. This survival in exile revealed something profound. The gods did not need temples or crowns to endure. They lived wherever their people remembered them, wherever rhythm of drum or whisper of prayer called them forth. Even when enslaved bodies bent under labor, the gods danced in the hidden beat of feet, sang in coded hymns, breathed in the resilience of survival. The Forbidden Kingdom's legacy was carried not in stone this time, but in flesh and spirit. It is tempting to think erasure succeeded, that because names were changed and temples fell, the gods were forgotten. But exile proved the opposite. Memory adapted, flowing around obstacles like water around rock, and in its adaptability lay strength. What had once been official worship became hidden resistance, ensuring that the gods remained alive, waiting for a time when they could rise again in full light. For exile is not the end of the journey. It is a passage. And in this passage, the gods gathered power, carried silently across centuries, preparing for resurgence in ways their oppressors could never imagine. No memory stays buried forever. Even after centuries of exile, whispers of the black gods began to surface once more, carried not only by oral tradition but by the earth itself. The sands of time, which had hidden their names, started to release them. Fragments of papyrus emerged from tombs, inscriptions were uncovered on walls, and ruins long dismissed as curiosities revealed astonishing truths. Slowly, the echoes of the Forbidden Kingdom grew louder, forcing the world to confront what it had tried to forget. The rediscovery of ancient texts was among the first signs of revival. Scrolls long buried in tombs or sealed within desert caves came into the hands of explorers, scholars, and treasure hunters. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells guiding souls into the afterlife, resurfaced not as superstition, but as evidence of a sophisticated theology of resurrection. Wisdom texts like the Instruction of Ptahhotep were translated, revealing ethical systems that predated and paralleled biblical proverbs. Each text that emerged chipped away at the lie that Africa had no philosophy, no law, no vision of eternity. Archaeology brought the stones back to voice. Excavations at Karnak, Luxor, and Nubia revealed temples aligned with solstices and inscribed with hymns to gods long erased from official history. Pyramids, once mocked as primitive tombs, were proven to be marvels of astronomical precision. The obelisks, still catching sunlight as they had thousands of years before, testified to an enduring genius. For every erasure, the earth offered evidence of resilience, exposing truths that could no longer be denied. The gods themselves returned through interpretation. Scholars began to notice parallels between Egyptian myths and biblical or Greco-Roman traditions. Osiris's resurrection and Christ's story, Isis as divine mother and Mary, Horus as messianic son. The similarities were too striking to dismiss, though often framed as coincidence or influence in the wrong direction. These comparisons forced recognition. The so-called foundations of later faiths rested on African soil. Beyond academia, the gods stirred in cultural consciousness. Artists, writers, and visionaries began reclaiming their names, painting Isis with wings spread across canvases, writing poetry to Ra, sculpting Horus as falcon-headed protector. In the African diaspora, especially, the call of ancestral gods found new expression. Spiritual traditions in the Caribbean and the Americas reconnected their orishas, loa, and ancestral spirits to the deeper, older pantheon of Kemet and Nubia. The gods were rising, not as dusty relics but as living presences, alive in art, ritual, and identity. This revival carried urgency. For centuries, people had been taught to be ashamed of their roots, told their gods were demons, their rituals sins. Rediscovering the Forbidden Kingdom was more than archaeology, it was healing. It was reclaiming dignity stolen by erasure, affirming that Africa had given the world not only gold and labor, but wisdom, law, and cosmic truth. Of course, resistance to this resurgence remained strong. Some dismissed it as fantasy, others as dangerous revisionism. But every fragment uncovered, every inscription translated, every alignment recalculated, chipped away at denial. The gods were proving too vast to stay hidden. Their presence could no longer be explained away, because their fingerprints covered the very foundations of global spirituality. The return of forgotten echoes shows that erasure is never final. Memory sleeps, but it does not die. When the time is right, it rises in the ground, in the sky, in the soul. The black gods were not relics. They were rivers flowing underground, breaking through stone, returning to nourish the present. And with their return came not just recognition of history, but inspiration for the future. For the people who rediscovered them realized that if these gods once built kingdoms, then their principles could still guide the rebuilding of identity, freedom, and truth today. The black gods did not return only as ancient curiosities or subjects of scholarly debate. They returned as living symbols, powerful enough to ignite resistance and inspire liberation. Wherever their names resurfaced, they carried with them a reminder that the people who first worshipped them had once built kingdoms, shaped laws, charted stars, and lived in harmony with cosmic balance. To reclaim the gods was to reclaim power, and power long denied could not re-emerge quietly. For oppressed peoples, especially across the African continent and the diaspora, the gods became anchors of identity. Enslaved Africans carried ancestral deities across oceans, hiding them under the masks of saints and angels. What overseers dismissed as harmless rituals were in truth coded acts of defiance, keeping alive the presence of spirits like Osiris, Isis, and their Yoruba and Vodun kin. Drums that sounded in the night were not only calls to dance, but calls to memory, pulses of resistance echoing against chains. Isis, eternal mother and healer, embodied the resilience of women who kept families alive in the harshest of conditions. She became the archetype of survival, the one who gathers fragments and makes them whole again. In her story, enslaved mothers saw their own work of stitching torn families together, preserving heritage under oppression. To whisper her essence was to whisper hope. Osiris, Lord of Resurrection, represented the promise that death and destruction were never final. His dismemberment and restoration mirrored the scattering of African peoples and their determination to rise again. To sing of Osiris in secret hymns was to proclaim that identity, though fragmented, would be reborn. Even when names were hidden, his principle of resurrection lived in every act of cultural survival. Horus, child of struggle, stood as a figure of justice and victory. His battle with Set symbolized the eternal conflict between tyranny and freedom. Enslaved and colonized peoples saw in Horus the vision of a falcon rising from the ashes, a promise that no oppressor could hold power forever. His eye, symbol of protection and truth, became an emblem not only of spirituality, but of political defiance. Even lesser-known deities carried the flame of resistance. Sekhmet, lioness of wrath, embodied righteous anger, her fiery breath invoked in times of revolt. Anubis, guardian of the dead, reminded people that ancestors watched and guided them still, urging them to endure and to fight. To remember the gods was to feel their presence in every act of resistance, whether whispered in prayer or shouted in rebellion. In the 20th century, as liberation movements swept across Africa and the diaspora, echoes of these gods returned again. Intellectuals and revolutionaries drew from ancient Kemet to remind their people of a heritage deeper than colonial narratives. Writers, poets, and musicians invoked the gods as symbols of pride and defiance, linking modern struggles to timeless myths. Even when unspoken, their presence was there in the imagery of wings, eyes, suns, and stars adorning posters, songs, and speeches. The gods' power of resistance lay not in nostalgia, but in continuity. They did not represent a lost golden age. They represented an eternal principle. That balance cannot be destroyed, only delayed. That truth may be buried but always rises. That identity, once denied, can always be reclaimed. To invoke the black gods was to awaken that truth in the hearts of the oppressed, to remind them that liberation was not invention, but restoration. Thus, the return of the gods was inseparable from the struggles for dignity, freedom, and justice. They were not silent statues, but voices carried on the wind of revolution. Their myths became manifest in uprisings, their symbols emblazoned in cultural revival, their spirit present in every movement that demanded truth over lies, freedom over bondage, balance over chaos. And in this revival, something even deeper was revealed, that the gods were not only protectors of the past, but teachers for the future, holding wisdom still urgently needed in a world that drifts further from balance. The return of the black gods is not only about honoring what was once erased, it is also about listening to what they still have to teach. Their myths, far from being relics, are repositories of wisdom, maps for how to live in balance with the world and with each other. In a time when chaos grows louder, when injustice spreads like wildfire, the lessons of the Forbidden Kingdom strike with renewed urgency. At the center stands Ma'at, the principle of truth, justice, and balance. Her feather was not only a measure for the dead, but a guide for the living. She reminds us that justice is not an abstract court ruling, but a way of life, a commitment to fairness in trade, honesty in speech, equity in power, and balance in community. To live by Ma'at is to see that every action has weight, every choice tips the scale, and peace depends on each person's devotion to harmony. Isis, the divine mother and healer, offers the lesson of restoration. Her myth of gathering Osiris's broken body teaches that wholeness can be reclaimed from fragments. In our fractured world, her lesson is clear. Healing comes not from denial of wounds, but from tenderly piecing them back together. Families torn by conflict, communities divided by oppression, souls shattered by trauma, all can find hope in her example. Healing is possible, and it is sacred work. Osiris, Lord of Resurrection, teaches the lesson of renewal. His death and rebirth affirm that endings are never final, that life is cyclical, that even in loss there is the seed of continuity. For those facing despair, his story whispers, "Rise again." For cultures told they are dead, his myth proclaims, "You still live." Renewal is not a distant miracle, it is embedded in the very cycles of nature and the resilience of spirit. Horus, the falcon child, embodies the lesson of vision and justice. He does not defeat, set with brute strength alone, but with clarity, persistence, and rightful claim. His falcon eyes remind us to see beyond illusions, to recognize truth even when chaos obscures it. For societies drowning in misinformation and falsehoods, Horus is a reminder to sharpen vision, to seek justice with clear sight, and to act not out of vengeance but out of rightful order. Thoth, keeper of wisdom and writing, offers the lesson of memory. He shows that knowledge is not power for its own sake, but a tool to preserve balance. To record truth is to resist erasure. In an age where lies spread faster than facts, Thoth's presence reminds us to guard memory, to write, to archive, to teach, so that no one can again silence entire peoples or gods. Sekhmet, the lioness, teaches that righteous anger has its place. She embodies the fire that rises when injustice festers. Her story reminds us that wrath must be tempered with compassion, but also that passivity in the face of cruelty is betrayal of balance. She teaches us to channel anger as fuel for transformation rather than destruction, Together, these gods remind us of something profound, that divinity is not distant or abstract. It is lived in daily choices, embodied in justice, compassion, courage, memory, and resilience. To honor them is not simply to build temples, but to live lives aligned with their principles. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that erasure is never final. The gods' survival through exile and suppression reveals that truth is indestructible. For those who feel powerless, this is the ultimate hope. If memory can survive centuries of silence, then justice can survive centuries of oppression. If the gods can rise after being buried, so too can people, cultures, and spirits. These lessons are not mere philosophy. They are a call to live differently, to build societies that reflect cosmic balance, to recognize that we are still participants in the same drama of creation. The black gods whisper that the story is not over, that humanity still stands at the scales, weighing truth against falsehood, justice against tyranny. And just as these gods shaped life, law, and cosmos, they also shape time itself. Their myths are not just moral guides, but cosmic calendars, embedding their lessons in the cycles of days, years, and ages, ensuring that their wisdom was never locked in the past, but always renewing in the present. Among all their gifts, law, healing, balance, and resurrection, perhaps the most profound, was the gods' teaching about time. In the Forbidden Kingdom, time was not a straight line marching toward an end. It was a circle, a rhythm, a cycle of death and rebirth. The black gods did not imagine eternity as something distant. Eternity pulsed in every sunrise, in every flood of the Nile, in every season of planting and harvest. To live by their wisdom was to live in sync with time itself. The daily cycle of the sun carried Ra's story. Each morning he rose in glory, sailing across the sky in triumph. Each evening he descended into the underworld, facing Apophis, the serpent of chaos. Each night he battled, and each dawn he returned. This rhythm taught the people that light always returns, that struggle is followed by victory, that darkness is never final. Time was not despair but assurance. The lunar cycle belonged to Thoth, who measured its waxing and waning as the heartbeats of wisdom. The full moon was not simply a phase, but a revelation light reborn out of shadow. Rituals aligned with the moon marked transitions of knowledge, initiation, and growth. To follow the moon was to learn patience, to see that wisdom unfolds in cycles, not in haste. The year itself was built around Sirius, the rising star that heralded the flood. When Sopdet appeared, the Nile swelled, Osiris returned, and the land awakened. This was the beginning of the year, the promise of fertility, the reminder that time itself was tied to resurrection. Unlike modern calendars, this system did not impose artificial divisions. It flowed with the river, the stars, the gods. Even ages of history were seen as cycles. Myths spoke of periods of harmony followed by disruption, then restoration. The battle between Horus and Set was not just a one-time event, but a pattern order challenged by chaos. Chaos overcome by balance, balance renewed. History itself was seen as this eternal rhythm. No defeat was permanent, no victory absolute. All things returned in their time. This cyclical view of time shaped how people lived. Death was not feared as an ending, but embraced as passage. Funerary rituals prepared souls to join Osiris in the eternal cycle, to be reborn in the afterlife, just as crops returned after harvest. Mourning was real, but so was hope, the assurance that ancestors lived on, guiding the living as part of the unbroken circle. It also shaped governance. Kings understood their reigns as part of a cycle of cosmic order. Coronations reenacted creation, reaffirming balance anew. Festivals were not mere celebrations but renewals, ensuring that time itself stayed aligned with divine rhythm. Every new year was a recreation of the first dawn, a fresh chance to participate in eternity. This mastery of time stands in stark contrast to later foreign narratives that insisted on linearity, a single beginning, a single end, a march toward final judgment. Such a view made time a weapon of control, instilling fear of an ending and urgency to conform. The Black Gods, by contrast, taught time as liberation, a cycle that always returns, a rhythm that promises renewal, a cosmos where no soul is ever truly lost. Even today, their mastery of time lingers. Farmers still watch the sky, for Sirius is rising. Communities still celebrate solstices, marking the sun's turn with feasts and rituals. The heartbeat of drums still echoes the pulse of cosmic rhythm. The gods' vision of time persists, whispering that eternity is not later, but now not linear, but cyclical. And in this understanding of time lies the foundation of legacy. For what returns, returns transformed. Just as Osiris rose renewed, just as Ra emerged victorious each dawn, so too do civilizations rise again after erasure. The gods' mastery of time is not only cosmic truth but cultural promise, that even what is buried will one day return. Though conquerors tried to erase the kingdom, its gods and principles did not vanish. Instead, they seeped into the foundations of later civilizations, hidden but unmistakable. What the world remembers as Greek philosophy, Hebrew law, or Christian theology often carries within it the fingerprints of black gods and African wisdom, smuggled across ages under new names and faces. The Forbidden Kingdom did not die, it disguised itself, shaping history from the shadows. Consider philosophy. Greek thinkers like Pythagoras and Plato studied in Egyptian temples, where they absorbed lessons of geometry, astronomy, and cosmic harmony. The idea that the universe is structured by balance, that the soul journeys beyond death, that truth is eternal. These were not inventions of Athens, but inheritances from the Nile. Plato's theory of forms echoes Ma'at's eternal truth. Pythagoras' sacred numbers reflect African geometry. Western philosophy carries African breath, though it rarely acknowledges its source. Law, too, bore this hidden legacy. The Hebrew commandments, celebrated as divine revelation, mirror older African moral codes. The prohibitions against false witness, theft, and injustice were already pillars of Ma'at's law. Proverbs found in the Hebrew Bible have parallels in Egyptian wisdom literature, like the instruction of Amenemope. Even the idea of weighing the heart against truth resonates in later notions of judgment. Yet, the lineage was buried, leaving later religions to claim originality. The imagery of resurrection also crossed borders. Osiris, dismembered and restored, became the archetype of dying and rising saviors. The promise that death is not final, that eternal life awaits the just, spread from Nile myths into global faiths. The Christian story of Christ, rising on the third day, echoes a pattern already alive in Osiris, whose green skin symbolized rebirth. But instead of honoring the source, later traditions condemned it as pagan, hiding the inheritance while using its core. Even cosmology migrated. The idea of the heavens as a sacred map, with constellations guiding time and prophecy, influenced Babylonian, Greek, and Hebrew star lore. The association of Sirius with fertility, Orion with divine kingship, the Milky Way as celestial river, these motifs traveled widely, embedded in myths that outlived their origin. The stars themselves carried the memory of African gods across borders, ensuring their presence even when their names were silenced. Art and architecture also bore traces of the Forbidden Kingdom. The use of columns shaped like lotus and papyrus reappeared in Greek temples. Obelisks, symbols of the sun's permanence, were carried to Rome, where they still stand as silent witnesses to their true origin. Even the Christian cross, symbol of eternal life, resembles the ankh, a far older emblem of life and divinity. Symbols were repurposed, but their essence remained African. The gods themselves survived under disguises. Isis was worshipped across the Roman Empire, her temples stretching as far as Britain. She merged into depictions of Mary, Mother of Christ, her image nursing Horus, rebranded as Madonna and Child. Osiris's role as judge of the dead re-emerged in later depictions of divine judgment. Horus's falcon eye became a protective amulet, echoed in later sacred symbols. Though renamed, they never left. This hidden legacy reveals a paradox. The very civilizations that mocked, suppressed, or demonized the black gods were unknowingly shaped by them. Their myths, laws, symbols, and philosophies could not escape the gravitational pull of African wisdom. The Forbidden Kingdom had built too strong a foundation. Even erasure could not sever its influence. But this inheritance came at a cost. By denying the true origin, later civilizations distorted the meaning, turning principles of balance into dogmas of control, symbols of life into weapons of domination. The gods' wisdom was preserved, but often in forms alien to their intent. The challenge today is to peel back those layers, to see the African roots still pulsing beneath global traditions, and to reclaim them with clarity. The Forbidden Kingdom's legacy proves that Africa was not silent in history but central. Its gods shaped law, philosophy, religion, and art far beyond its borders. And this hidden legacy also ensured something greater, that the gods, though erased, could never truly die. For what is hidden may yet be revealed, and revelation itself is part of the gods' rhythm. Which brings us to the most striking truth, that even in modern times, their memory continues to rise, inspiring not only historical recognition but spiritual revival. The world that once tried to erase the black gods now finds itself haunted by their return. Their names reappear in books, their images flood museums, their symbols are tattooed on skin, worn as jewelry, and studied as philosophy. Archaeologists uncover buried temples, linguists decode sacred texts, and spiritual seekers find in their myths the truths that modern religions have failed to answer. The forgotten gods are awakening, not as relics but as living presences. In academic halls, once dismissive of African genius, a shift has begun. Scholars admit that Egyptian philosophy shaped Greece, that African cosmology shaped Abrahamic traditions, that Nubia and Kush were not shadows of Egypt but kingdoms of equal brilliance. Each new discovery strips away centuries of denial, returning dignity to a people whose heritage was stolen. The gods are revealed not as footnotes, but as origin. In the diaspora, this awakening feels like healing. Descendants of enslaved Africans look back across centuries of disconnection and find the gods waiting. Isis becomes a symbol of black motherhood, Osiris of resilience, Horus of justice, Ma'at of truth. Drums once silenced by overseers now beat in festivals and ceremonies, calling back ancestral spirits. In the Caribbean and the Americas, syncretic traditions like Vodou, Santeria, and Candomblé are embraced not as superstition but as survival living threads that connect directly to the Forbidden Kingdom. Artists carry the gods into the present. Painters drape Isis across canvases with wings outstretched. Musicians invoke Ra and Ma'at in lyrics that fuse ancient wisdom with modern struggles. Filmmakers reimagine the falcon's eye and the sun bark, reclaiming symbols long demonized. Through art, the gods reclaim space in imagination, guiding people not with commandments but with inspiration. The awakening also manifests in personal spirituality. Individuals across the world study Egyptian texts, practice rituals of offering, meditate on Ma'at, or wear the Ankh as a living prayer. The gods no longer belong to dusty temples but to anyone willing to walk in balance, to see divinity in themselves, to honor ancestry. The act of remembering becomes an act of empowerment, grounding identity in roots deeper than colonial lies. This resurgence, however, is not without resistance. Religious orthodoxy bristles at the recognition that its foundations lie in Africa. Institutions that benefit from the narrative of erasure resist its undoing. But truth is persistent. Each year, more people awaken, more books are written, more rituals revived, more voices speak. the tide of memory grows unstoppable. The God's awakening is not only about reclaiming history, it is about reclaiming the future. For to remember them is to remember that justice is balance, that life is eternal, that healing comes from wholeness, that humanity is divine. In a world fractured by greed, violence, and forgetfulness, their return is not nostalgia, it is necessity. And this awakening leads to the final truth, that the Forbidden Kingdom itself, though buried in sand and silence, was never truly lost. Its legacy pulses in every heartbeat of resistance, every prayer of justice, every act of balance, which brings us to the final revelation, the Forbidden Kingdom that the gods built, the realm erased from history, and the memory we are only now beginning to reclaim. The kingdom built by the Black Gods was more than a geographical place. It was a living harmony between people, land, stars, and spirit. It thrived because it recognized that life itself is sacred, that every sunrise is a renewal, that every death is a passage, that every law must honor truth. To erase it, conquerors tried to bury its temples, burn its scrolls, and shame its people. Yet the kingdom survives not in maps, but in memory, not in ruins, but in rhythm. Its architecture still stands, defiant against time, pyramids and temples aligned with stars, as proof that the gods once ruled the earth. Its texts still speak, wisdom literature revealing ethics that rival any modern philosophy. Its rituals still live, disguised as folk practices, whispered in diaspora traditions, encoded in songs that cross oceans. Its symbols, the Ankh, the eye, the feather, the sun, are carved into global consciousness, resurfacing whenever humanity seeks balance. The Forbidden Kingdom is forbidden only because it threatens false narratives. To restore it is not to rebuild palaces of stone, but to rebuild memory. Restoration is recognizing Africa as cradle not only of humanity, but of civilization, spirituality, and cosmic truth. It is seeing the gods not as relics, but as companions. It is refusing shame and embracing pride in ancestors who taught the world to write, to heal, to align with the stars. It is living again by Ma'at, by balance, in a world desperate for harmony. The Forbidden Kingdom was erased because it was too powerful, too free, too radiant, but erasure failed. Today, as the gods awaken, the kingdom rises too, not as empire, but as principle. Not as monarchy, but as movement, in every person who lives truthfully, who honors ancestors, who sees divinity in themselves. The kingdom breathes again. Perhaps this was always the God's plan, that the kingdom would not be bound by walls, that it could not be conquered by swords, that it would survive even without temples, that it would live wherever its people carried it across deserts, across oceans, across centuries. The Forbidden Kingdom is not lost. It is here, now, waiting to be recognized. And as we remember, we step into its gates once more. The Black Gods stand where they always have, shaping the sun, the stars, and the beginning of time itself. Their kingdom endures not in ruins, but in us. To honor them is to restore balance, to reclaim memory, to walk once more in the eternal rhythm of life. The Forbidden Kingdom lives,